The floorboards under my knees were honest. That's a strange thing to think, I know. But when your world is small, you find truth in small things. The floorboards didn't lie. They told the story of every person who walked on them, every bit of mud and trouble they dragged in from the street. My job was to wash those stories away. The smell of lye soap and damp pine filled the little room I rented at the back of the boarding house. It was a clean smell, an honest smell. The scrape of my brush against the wood was a steady rhythm, a song only I could hear. Scrape, dip, swirl, scrape, 16 hours a day, most days. But it was my work, it was my own. My mind wasn't on the ache in my back, or the way the bristles bit into the soft skin of my palms. No, my mind was on a ribbon, a blue ribbon, the color of a robin's egg. I'd seen it in the window of the mercantile, a tiny splash of sky in a world made of dust and wood. Just a few more days of scrubbing, I told myself. A few more floors, and that little piece of sky would be mine. It was a simple dream, the kind a girl like me was allowed to have, a foolish, pretty thing to tie in my plain brown hair. It was a promise that life wasn't only about the color of dirt. Before we ride into this story, do me a favor. If you love the Wild West and stories of true grit, hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm we're the real deal. And stick around because the twist at the end of this tale is a rattlesnake you won't see coming. I was 19 years old. 10 of those years I'd been alone since the fever took my mother. The orphanage in Denver taught me two things: stay quiet and work hard. So that's what I did. And here in this town, it had almost been enough. People nodded. They didn't smile, not really, but they nodded. Mrs. Weller, the banker's wife, would even leave a leftover biscuit for me on the counter sometimes. On Tuesdays. Today was a Tuesday. I was thinking about that biscuit, about the ribbon, about the simple, quiet shape of my life. That's when the world ended. It didn't end with a thunderclap or a storm. It ended with the sound of my own door crashing open. Not knocked, not pushed, slammed. The wood splintered. The noise ripped through the quiet of my room, so violent it felt like a physical blow. I froze. My hand still in the bucket, soapy water dripping onto the floor I'd just cleaned. Two shadows fell across me, blotting out the afternoon sun. The first was Sheriff Colt. His face was flushed, his breath a foul mix of whiskey and chewing tobacco that reached me even from the doorway. His gut strained against the buttons of his vest. He wasn't a man of the law. He was a man of force. And behind him, stood Mrs. Weller. She was always so put together. Her silk dresses never had a single wrinkle. Her hair never had a single strand out of place. But today, her face was a mask of cold porcelain, and her eyes were on me. Not like she was looking at the girl who scrubbed her floors. She was looking at something vile, something she wanted to crush under her heel. My heart started to pound, a frantic drum against my ribs. "Sheriff? Mrs. Weller?" My voice came out as a whisper, thin and useless. Is something wrong?" Sheriff Colt took a step forward, his boots heavy on my clean floor. He didn't answer. He just pointed a thick, trembling finger at me. "There she is," he growled. "The little thief." The word hit me, but it didn't make sense. It was like he was speaking a foreign language. Thief? I had never taken so much as a bent nail in my life. The biscuits Mrs. Weller left me, I always asked first if I was sure she was still home. Mrs. Weller's voice cut through my confusion, sharp and cold as ice. "Don't play the innocent with us, girl. My grandmother's pearls. The necklace I showed you last week." Pearls? Her grandmother's pearls? My mind was a blank wall. I remembered her showing me a necklace, yes. She'd held it up to the light, bragging about how it came all the way from Boston. I remembered thinking the pearls looked like tiny pale moons. I had told her they were beautiful, and then I had gone back to cleaning her fireplace. I don't understand," I stammered, pushing myself up from my knees. My dress was damp, my hands were raw. "You understand this," Sheriff Colt snarled. And then he moved. He lunged for me. His fingers, thick as sausages, dug into the meat of my arm. The simple brown fabric of my dress, worn thin from too many washings, gave way with a sickening rip. The sound was louder than the door breaking. It was the sound of my life tearing apart. Pain shot up my shoulder. A scream caught in my throat. He dragged me, He dragged me out of my room, past the bucket of dirty water, across the boarding house porch. My bare feet scraped against the rough wood. Splinters dug into my skin. I saw the faces of the other boarders peeking out from their doors, their eyes wide with fear and a terrible kind of excitement. No one moved. No one spoke for me. Out into the street. The afternoon sun was a brutal, blinding light. The dust of the street was hot and soft under my feet, a puff of brown with every stumbling step. He was dragging me toward the town square, and the whole town was gathering to watch. Men in worn hats, women clutching shawls. Their whispers followed us like buzzing flies. Thief, the orphan girl, well as pearls. The words were stones, and they were all throwing them at me. I saw the baker whose bread I bought every Saturday. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I saw the blacksmith's wife who I'd helped when her little boy fell and scraped his knee. She pulled her own children closer, as if I were a disease. My mind was screaming. This is a mistake, a terrible mistake. Tell them, just tell them. But my voice was gone, trapped behind the terror. Then I saw it, in the center of the square where they held the 4th of July celebrations. It stood there, black and monstrous against the dying sun. A massive iron kettle, big enough to bathe a horse in, and underneath it, a fire was already burning. Orange flames licked at the kettle's rounded belly. A wisp of steam curled from the top like a single ghostly finger beckoning me forward. The heat reached me, a wave of impossible warmth. My legs gave out. I would have collapsed into the dust if the sheriff wasn't holding me up by my torn dress. A low murmur went through the crowd, a hungry sound, and in that moment, staring at the steam rising from that terrible pot, I finally understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was justice, frontier justice, and they were going to boil me alive. The heat from that kettle was a living thing. It wrapped around my back, a predator's embrace, while the afternoon sun continued its slow, merciless descent in front of me. I was trapped between two fires, one in the sky, one on the earth, and in the center of it all was me. Sheriff Colt shoved me forward, my bare feet stumbling in the thick dust. He spun me around to face the crowd, his rough hands binding my wrists in front of me with a piece of coarse rope that bit into my skin like 1,000 tiny teeth. The knot was tight, final. I was an animal being prepared for slaughter, a spectacle. I could see every face, every pair of eyes. They weren't angry, not really. They were hungry. Hungry for a story, hungry for a show. In a town made of dust and boredom, a good hanging or a good boiling was the best entertainment you could ask for. And today, I was the star. I tried to stand tall. I thought of my mother, though her face was a watercolor painting washed out by years of rain. What would she have thought of her daughter now? A thief? Accused and condemned without a single question? I lifted my chin, a small, pathetic act of defiance. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. But on the outside, I would not give them the satisfaction of my tears. Not yet. "This here," the sheriff's voice boomed across the square, making a few nearby children jump. "This is what happens to thieves in this town. This is what happens when you take from decent, hard-working folk." He gestured toward Mrs. Weller, who stepped forward like a queen addressing her subjects. She held up the pearl necklace. The little moons caught the dying sunlight, glowing with a soft, milky light. It was beautiful. So beautiful it made my stomach hurt. "My grandmother brought these pearls all the way from Boston," she announced, her voice ringing with practiced sorrow. "A family heirloom. And this creature thought she could steal it, from my own home, from under my own roof." A voice from the crowd, a man I didn't recognize, shouted back, "Boil the thief! Teach her a lesson!" A chorus of agreement followed. The sound was a physical wave crashing over me. The world tilted. The faces of the crowd swam before my eyes. They had already decided. My trial was over before it had even begun, because who would believe me? A poor orphan girl who scrubbed floors for a living, who would take my word against the word of the banker's wife? "String her up over the kettle," Sheriff Colt barked to his deputy, a nervous young man named Pike. I knew Pike. He was barely older than me. Sometimes he'd leave a penny on the bar for me at the saloon when I was cleaning up spilled beer and sawdust. He always had a kind word. Today, he wouldn't look at me. His hands fumbled with the rope system they had rigged to a thick wooden beam above the enormous pot. A pulley, a sling, a mechanism for murder. Steam was rising in earnest now, thick and white, smelling of hot metal and something else, something that smelled like fear, my fear. It was thick and metallic in the air, a taste on the back of my tongue. I closed my eyes. I couldn't bear to look at their faces anymore. The hungry eyes, the grim satisfaction. Instead, I tried to find that quiet place in my mind, the place where I kept the memory of my mother's lullaby. It was a faint melody, a song about stars dancing in a desert sky. It was all I had left of her. But the tune wouldn't come. All I could hear was the crackling of the fire, the bubbling of the water, and the pounding of my own blood in my ears. Each pop from the kettle was like a tiny scream. Mrs. Weller stepped closer, her silk dress a stark, offensive blue against the brown, dusty square. "Get on with it, Colt, before whoever that is decides to interfere with proper justice." Her words barely registered, because I heard it too. Underneath the noise of the crowd, another sound was emerging, faint at first, a low, rhythmic thumping, hoofbeats. Not the slow clop-clop of a farmer's wagon. This was fast, urgent, a desperate drumming on the hard-packed earth of the eastern road. Someone was coming, and they were coming in a hurry. The crowd began to murmur, their attention shifting from me to the rising cloud of dust on the horizon. A flicker of something I hadn't dared to feel sparked inside me. Hope. It was a foolish, dangerous thing. "Get her feet tied," Colt ordered Pike, his voice laced with annoyance. He was losing his audience. "Don't matter who's coming. Justice waits for no man." Pike scrambled to obey, his nervous hands grabbing at my ankles. The rough hemp rope scratched against my skin as he bound them tight. The heat from the boiling water was intense now, stinging my legs through the thin fabric of my dress. I could feel the individual droplets of moisture in the air. The world had shrunk to this single terrible moment, the rope, the heat, the bubbling water. But the thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, closer, a furious, relentless sound that seemed to shake the very ground. Through the dust cloud I could make out a single rider, a dark shape bent low over his horse's neck. He was pushing the animal hard, a man on a mission. Pike tested the pulley. I felt myself being lifted, my feet leaving the blessed solidity of the earth. The rope bit into my bound wrists, cutting off the feeling in my hands. I was a puppet, dangling at the mercy of a nervous boy and a drunken sheriff. This is it, I thought. This is the end of my story. And then he burst into the square, the rider. He pulled his horse to a skidding halt, the animal's flanks heaving, lathered in sweat. The man was tall, even sitting on his horse. He wore a weathered hat, pulled low. Iron gray hair escaped from the sides. His face was a map of hard lines, carved by sun and wind and too many hard seasons. But it was his eyes that silenced the entire town. They were dark as storm clouds and twice as dangerous. They swept across the scene, the boiling kettle, the gloating Mrs. Weller, the hungry faces of the crowd, and me, dangling from a rope. And his eyes, they stopped on me. For a split second, the world fell away. The noise, the heat, everything. There was only the intense, burning gaze of this stranger, and in his eyes I saw something that made my breath catch in my chest. It wasn't pity, it wasn't anger, it was recognition. A look of such profound shock, it was like he was seeing a ghost. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his boots hitting the dirt with an authority that made even Sheriff Colt pause. "What in hell is going on here?" His voice wasn't a shout, but it carried across the square like thunder. It was a voice used to being obeyed. Mrs. Weller, ever the self-important one, straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Marsh," she said, her tone dripping with false respect. "This doesn't concern you. We're dealing with a thief, according to the law." The stranger, Mr. Marsh, his eyes never left me. "What law?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Says you boil a child for stealing." "She's no child," Mrs. Weller snapped, her composure cracking slightly. "She's 19 and old enough to know right from wrong, old enough to pay for her crimes." But Gideon Marsh wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at me, his gaze so intense it felt like he was peeling back my skin, looking straight into my soul. His hands, weathered and strong, started to shake just slightly. He took a step closer, and then he said two words that changed everything. "Lower her down." Sheriff Colt let out a short, incredulous laugh. Now hold on there, Marsh. I know you got pull in this town on account of your land and cattle, but this here's official business. And that's when Gideon Marsh did something no one in that square could have ever expected. He drew his gun. It happened faster than a blink. One moment his hand was at his side, the next, a long-barreled Colt revolver was in his fist, aimed directly at the sheriff's chest. The click of the hammer being pulled back was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The entire town square fell utterly silent. The only sound was the crackling of the fire beneath the kettle. "I said," Gideon Marsh repeated, his voice low and deadly serious. "Lower her down. Now." The sheriff's face went pale as a sheet. The bravado, the drunken authority, it all melted away, leaving behind a scared, pasty-faced man. "You're making a mistake, Marsh," he stammered, his voice losing its power. "Drawing on a lawman is a hanging offense." "So is murdering an innocent girl," Gideon replied. His eyes never left the sheriff, but I could feel his attention on me. It was a strange, protective feeling, like standing in the shelter of a great oak during a storm. Why? Why was he doing this? Mrs. Weller, her face flushed with indignation, stepped forward. "Mr. Marsh, I understand you have influence, but you cannot simply—" "Pike!" Gideon's voice cut her off, but he wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking directly to the young deputy, who was frozen by the ropes, staring at the gun with wide, terrified eyes. "Lower her down, gentle-like." Pike looked from his boss to the unwavering barrel of Gideon's gun. Sweat was running down his face in rivers. His hands shook violently as he slowly, carefully began to work the rope system. I felt myself descending. The terrible heat lessened. The ground rushed up to meet me. The relief was so overwhelming it was a physical force making my knees weak. I landed on my feet, stumbling, but I was on solid earth. I was alive, but I still couldn't understand. I had never seen this man before in my life. Why would this powerful stranger risk a hanging for a girl who scrubbed floors? "This is madness," Mrs. Weller shrieked, her voice shrill with fury. "She stole from me. I have witnesses." "What witnesses?" Gideon asked, his gun still trained on Colt's chest. Mrs. Weller gestured vaguely toward the crowd. "Well, that is to say, she was the only one with access to my jewelry box. Who else could it have been?" Gideon's jaw tightened. "So you don't actually have witnesses," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "You just decided she was guilty because she's poor." The crowd began to murmur among themselves, the seed of doubt now planted. "Cut her loose," Gideon ordered Pike. "Now see here," Sheriff Colt blustered, trying to regain some semblance of control, his voice cracking. "You can't just—" Crack! The sound of Gideon's gun firing into the air was like a bolt of lightning. It silenced every voice, every whisper, every breath in the square. His horse reared at the sound, but Gideon controlled the powerful animal with his free hand, his gun still ready. "Next shot goes into flesh," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a promise of absolute violence. He looked back at the terrified deputy. "Cut her loose." Pike didn't need to be told again. He pulled a small knife from his belt, and in 2 quick slashes, the ropes binding my hands and feet fell away. I stumbled forward, rubbing my wrists where the hemp had cut into my skin, leaving angry red welts. I still didn't dare to believe it. I was alive. I was free. But as I looked at the faces in the crowd, I knew my ordeal was far from over. Gideon Marsh had saved me from the kettle, but in doing so, he had made an enemy of the most powerful people in town, and I still had no idea why. That's when Mrs. Weller, seeing she was losing, played her final card. "If you're so certain she's innocent," she called out, her voice loud and clear for everyone to hear, "then prove it. Find my real necklace. But until you do, this thief stays in jail where she belongs." The crowd roared their approval. It was a reasonable proposition. It sounded like law. It sounded like justice. Even with Gideon's gun, they had the numbers. He couldn't fight the whole town. I saw it in his eyes. He knew it too. But what I couldn't see, what no one could see, was the storm of memories crashing through Gideon's mind as he looked at my face. He holstered his gun slowly, a gesture of concession that made the crowd press closer, sensing their power returning. But then he raised his hand, not in surrender, but in a gesture that somehow commanded respect. "She'll stay at my ranch," he announced, his voice booming with authority once more, "until this gets sorted proper." Sheriff Colt's face flushed a blotchy red. "Like hell she will. She's under arrest for theft." "Then arrest me too," Gideon said calmly, his eyes locking with mine, "because she's coming with me." As he spoke, something profound and unreadable passed through his gaze. A deep, ancient sorrow. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost he had long ago given up on, a memory trying to surface like a fish fighting its way upstream. Mrs. Weller, seeing her advantage slipping away again, stepped between us. "Mr. Marsh, you're being foolish. This girl is nothing but trouble." And then Gideon asked the question that unraveled everything. "What's her full name?" The question caught everyone off guard. It hung in the air, simple and strange. What does that matter?" Mrs. Weller blinked, confused. "Her full name?" Gideon repeated, his voice taking on a dangerous, razor-sharp edge. He wasn't looking at Mrs. Weller. He was looking at me, waiting. For the first time since I was dragged from my room, I found my voice. It was hoarse, raspy, but it was steady. "Mercy," I said, my eyes locked with his. "Mercy Eleanor Whitmore." The name, my middle name, the name I had been told was my mother's, hit Gideon Marsh like a physical blow. I saw him stagger back a half step, his face draining of all color. His hands, the same hands that had held a gun with unwavering stillness, began to shake. The puzzle pieces in his mind were no longer just falling into place. They were slamming together with the force of a rock slide. "Where were you born?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "California," I answered, confused by the line of questioning, but compelled to answer by the sheer force of his will. "But I don't remember much. I was brought to the orphanage in Denver when I was small. They said my aunt couldn't care for me anymore." His face contorted, a mixture of rage and a grief so profound it was terrifying to witness. But the rage wasn't for me. It was for himself. "How old are you?" he asked, his final question hanging in the dead air. 19, I replied. "Born in March, near as anyone can figure." March. His vision blurred. His whole body trembled as the last piece of the puzzle, the piece he never knew was missing, crashed into place. This girl, this brave young woman who had faced boiling death without begging, who stood tall even when the world was crushing her. The crowd was getting restless again. Someone shouted from the back, "Enough talk, string her up." But Mrs. Weller was watching Gideon's face now, and she didn't like what she saw. A dawning horror was spreading across her features. "Mr. Marsh," she said slowly, her voice laced with a new kind of fear. "Surely you're not suggesting that this common thief has some connection to your family?" Gideon Marsh finally tore his eyes away from me. He turned and looked at Mrs. Weller. His eyes were no longer dark and stormy. They had gone cold as a winter grave, and he spoke the words that shattered the world. "Mrs. Weller," he said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent square, "you just tried to murder my daughter." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. My daughter. My daughter. My knees buckled. My mind reeled. The dusty square. The faces. The kettle. It all spun into a blur. The only thing I could see clearly was the face of this stranger who claimed to be my father. His eyes full of a fierce, protective fire, and a sorrow so deep it threatened to swallow me whole. The crowd fell silent, their hunger for spectacle replaced by stunned, slack-jawed disbelief. And in that moment of stunned silence, Mrs. Weller did something that sealed her fate. She smiled. It wasn't a real smile. It was a cold, calculating thing, the expression of someone who had just realized they held all the cards. Or so she thought. "Your daughter?" she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. Theatrics. She was a master of it. "Oh, Mr. Marsh, I understand grief can make a man see things that aren't there. But this girl is nothing but a common thief who has clearly bewitched you with some sob story." Her words were meant to sow doubt, to turn his heroic act into the ramblings of a grieving old man. But her words had the opposite effect on me. A fire, hot and fierce, erupted in my chest, burning away the shock and fear. I looked at him, at this man, Gideon Marsh, and a torrent of questions and emotions crashed through me. Could it be true? The father I had dreamed about during countless lonely nights at the orphanage. The father I had eventually convinced myself had never existed. "You're lying," I whispered, the words directed at Mrs. Weller. But my eyes were searching his face, desperately looking for a piece of myself. The stubborn set of his jaw. It did look familiar somehow. The way he stood, planted and unmovable, like an old oak tree. Gideon stepped closer to me then, away from the crowd, creating a small, sacred space for just the two of us. When he spoke, his voice was no longer the thunder that had shaken the square. It was thick with an emotion that was almost too painful to hear. "Your mother's name was Elena," he said, his eyes holding mine. "She had a birthmark on her left wrist, shaped like a crescent moon, and she sang you a lullaby about stars dancing in the desert sky." My knees gave out for real this time. If he hadn't reached out and steadied me with a hand on my arm, I would have collapsed. How? How could he know those things? The crescent moon. I looked down at my own left wrist. There it was. A faint, pale mark I'd had my entire life. One I'd never thought twice about. And the lullaby. I had vague, dreamlike memories of a woman with dark hair singing to me a sweet, sad melody that I could feel but never quite recall. I had always assumed it was a half-forgotten dream from the orphanage. The crowd was murmuring now, a low, confused rumble. Their bloodlust was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. They had come for a simple boiling. They were getting a family drama more tangled than any dime novel. But Mrs. Weller wasn't finished. She was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. "Even if she is your long-lost daughter," she shouted, her voice sharp, trying to regain control, "that doesn't change the fact that she stole my necklace. Family or not, theft is theft." "Then where's your proof?" Gideon demanded, his voice turning hard as iron again. Mrs. Weller's eyes glittered with a triumphant, malicious light. "I have proof. I found the necklace hidden in her room at the boarding house. Sheriff Colt was there. He saw it too." Sheriff Colt, looking deeply uncomfortable now, nodded reluctantly. That's true, Marsh. Found it wrapped in a cloth under her mattress." Gideon turned to me. His face was a storm of conflict. For the first time since he'd ridden into town, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had found his daughter, a daughter he believed was lost forever, only to be told she was a common thief. The word of the banker's wife and the town's sheriff against the word of a girl he hadn't seen in 19 years. "Did you take it?" he asked me. His voice was quiet, but the question was a cannonball. Everything depended on my answer. My life. His faith. I looked him straight in the eye. I let him see the truth in mine. The truth I had been screaming on the inside all afternoon. "No," I said firmly, my voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even me. "I swear on my mother's grave, the mother you knew, I have never stolen anything in my life." He stared into my eyes for a long, silent moment. The entire town held its breath. It was a standoff between a father's hope and a town's prejudice. Then he turned to face Mrs. Weller, and the look on his face made her take an involuntary step backward. "If she's guilty," he said slowly, his voice dangerously calm, "then prove it wasn't planted." Mrs. Weller's face flushed a blotchy red. "How dare you suggest—" "Easy enough to prove," Gideon continued, his voice cutting through her protests like a sharp knife. He was on the offensive now, relentless. Let's search your house, right now. If the necklace was really stolen, there might be other items missing, other things disturbed. But if it was planted to frame her, then I'd bet my entire ranch that that necklace never left your jewelry box until you took it out this morning. The banker's wife had gone pale. That's absurd. You can't just— What's absurd? Gideon interrupted, his voice getting quieter, which somehow made it more menacing. Is that a girl who's worked for you for 3 years without a single incident would suddenly risk being boiled alive to steal one necklace. What's absurd is that you were so eager to see her dead that you didn't even wait for a proper trial. Sheriff Colt was squirming, looking at the ground, at the sky, anywhere but at Gideon or Mrs. Weller. Mrs. Weller, maybe we should— Shut up, Colt, she snapped at him, her voice cracking with desperation. She caught herself, but the damage was done. The crowd had heard the panic in her voice. They were starting to see the cracks in the porcelain mask. Gideon pressed his advantage, moving in for the kill. Tell me, Mrs. Weller, when exactly did you discover the necklace was missing? This morning, she stammered, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. And when did you last see it before then? Her eyes darted around the crowd, looking for support, but finding only curious, suspicious faces. Last week sometime. I don't recall the exact day. Gideon's voice was a whisper now, a cold wind that cut to the bone. You can't remember the last time you saw your grandmother's precious necklace? The one brought all the way from Boston? That's when Deputy Pike cleared his throat. It was a small, nervous sound, but in the silence it was as loud as a gunshot. Mrs. Weller's face went white as fresh snow. Sheriff Colt shot his deputy a look that could kill, a look that said, "You keep your mouth shut." But Pike was young, and his conscience was a heavier burden than his sheriff's glare. What is it, son? Gideon asked, his voice gentle now, encouraging. Pike swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He glanced at Mrs. Weller, who was glaring at him with pure, murderous fury. Well, sir, he began, his voice shaking. When we searched the girl's room, Mrs. Weller, she knew exactly where to look. Went straight to that spot under the mattress. Like she'd put something there herself. A loud gasp went through the crowd. It was no longer a murmur. It was the sound of a town realizing it had been duped, that it had bayed for the blood of an innocent girl at the behest of a liar. Mrs. Weller tried to recover, her voice high and strained. I simply have experience with servants. I know all their little hiding places. But the lie was too thin. The truth was unraveling like a cheap sweater. Gideon wasn't finished. He walked over to where Mrs. Weller stood, clutching the pearl necklace in her gloved hand as if it were a shield. He held out his own weathered, empty hand. May I see it? Absolutely not, she hissed, clutching it tighter. If it's evidence in a crime, then the law says I can examine it, Gideon replied calmly, unless you've got something to hide. Sheriff Colt, finally seeing which way the wind was blowing and trying desperately to save his own skin, stepped forward. Hand it over, Harriet, he said, his voice grim. Let the man take a look. With obvious, seething reluctance, she placed the necklace in Gideon's palm. He held it up, letting the dying light play across the pearls. He examined each one carefully, turning the necklace over and over in his hands. And then, just as he had before, he smiled. It was a cold, knowing smile, a victor's smile. Beautiful work, he said conversationally. These pearls are perfectly matched. Must have cost a fortune. Mrs. Weller preened slightly, falling into the trap. It was my grandmother's most prized possession. Funny thing about old pearls, Gideon continued, his voice light, as if he were discussing the weather. They develop a certain kind of patina over time, a softness to their luster, especially if they've been handled regularly, worn against the skin. He looked closer at the necklace, holding one of the pearls between his thumb and forefinger. But these pearls, they're too bright, too clean. They almost look new. I watched the exchange, my heart hammering with a wild, soaring hope. Could it be that simple? Could a lie be undone by the simple truth of an object? "What are you suggesting?" Mrs. Weller demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "I'm suggesting," Gideon said, his voice carrying across the silent, captivated square, "that this necklace was purchased recently, maybe even yesterday." The crowd erupted. Shocked murmurs turned into loud, angry chatter. Mrs. Weller's face cycled through a series of emotions: indignation, rage, and finally pure, unadulterated panic. "How dare you! That necklace belonged to my grandmother." But Gideon wasn't done. He turned to address the crowd directly, making them part of the trial. "Anyone here know Thomas Brennan, the jeweler over in Carson City?" Several people nodded. One man called out, "Sure, bought my wife's wedding ring from him." "Thomas is an old friend of mine," Gideon continued, his voice steady and confident. "And I'd bet my last dollar that if we rode over there right now, he'd remember selling a brand new pearl necklace to a well-dressed lady sometime this week." Mrs. Weller was backing away now, her eyes darting toward the edge of the crowd like a trapped animal looking for an escape. There was no escape. The very people who had been on her side moments ago were now forming a wall of hostile faces. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked. "I won't stand here and be accused by some common rancher." It was the wrong thing to say. Calling Gideon Marsh, a man whose land and cattle were the lifeblood of the region, common in front of this crowd was like throwing gasoline on a fire. The mood shifted palpably. The last vestiges of respect for the banker's wife evaporated into the dusty air. Tears were stinging my eyes now, but they were not tears of fear. They were tears of overwhelming, impossible relief. "You mean she made it all up?" I whispered, the question directed at Gideon. "Every word of it," he said grimly, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Weller's crumbling facade. "The question is why." Sheriff Colt looked physically ill. "Harriet," he said, his voice shaking, "if you knowingly made a false accusation—" "I didn't!" she screamed, her composure completely shattering. "She's a thief. She's always been a thief, just like her mother." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, her own. She realized what she had said a moment too late, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture of pure horror. The square went dead silent again. Gideon's eyes went deadly quiet. "What?" he said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Did you just say about her mother?" But she had already said too much. In that moment of silence, the truth, the real truth, the dark and poisonous root of all this, began to unfold. I stared at the banker's wife, my mind racing, connecting dots I never knew existed. Her hatred for me, it was too personal, too vicious for just a simple theft. "You knew," I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "You knew who I was all along." And with that, Mrs. Weller turned and ran. So, the dust has settled in that town square. The fire beneath the kettle is nothing but cold ash, and the ropes that bound Mercy Whitmore are gone. But the story stays with us. It lingers in the air like the scent of smoke after a fire, because it wasn't just about a girl, a gunslinger, and a liar. It was about us. It was about the moments in our own lives when we stand in the center of a square, with the hungry eyes of the world on us, and we are forced to make a choice. Have you ever felt like Mercy? Maybe not with a rope around your wrists, but trapped all the same. Trapped by a label someone else gave you. The quiet one, the troublemaker, the one who came from nothing. The world is very good at building kettles for us. It tells us what we are, what we're capable of, and what we deserve. And the fire beneath that kettle is fueled by the whispers of doubt, the easy judgments of the crowd, the weight of other people's expectations. Mercy's greatest act of courage wasn't just surviving the ordeal. It was that single, unwavering word she spoke to Gideon when he looked her in the eye and asked if she did it. No. In that one word, she held onto her truth when the entire world had agreed on a lie. How many times have we been tempted to let our own truth go? To just agree with the label, to accept the role we've been handed because it's easier than fighting? We let a boss's unfair criticism define our worth. We let a family member's old opinion of us dictate our choices. We let our own past mistakes whisper to us that we don't deserve a second chance. The lesson from mercy is this: your truth has weight, even if you are the only one holding it. It is your anchor in the storm. It is the one thing they cannot take from you unless you give it away. Holding on to that inner integrity, that quiet, fierce knowledge of who you are when no one is looking, that is not just survival, that is victory. It is the force that calls a Gideon Marsh out of the wilderness. And then there is Mrs. Weller. It would be easy to just call her a villain, to dismiss her as pure evil. But that's too simple. Mrs. Weller is a warning. She is a ghost story of what happens when we let our own pain fester into poison. Think about it. Her rage didn't start that Tuesday. It started 20 years earlier, born from a seed of jealousy, of feeling second best, of a love she felt was stolen from her. For 20 years, she watered that seed with bitterness. She nurtured it with resentment. She allowed it to grow in the dark, twisting its roots around her soul until it choked out everything else: her decency, her compassion, her humanity. The necklace wasn't the point. Mercy wasn't even the point. They were just the final, desperate expressions of a poison that had been rotting her from the inside out for 2 decades. She wasn't just trying to boil mercy alive, she was trying to boil away the ghost of her own misery. And that is a battle we all face in our own way. What are the old wounds we refuse to let heal? The resentments we carry against a friend, a family member, a former partner? The quiet, bitter stories we tell ourselves about what we've lost or what was taken from us. If we are not careful, that pain will become our identity. It will start making decisions for us. It will convince us that hurting someone else will somehow soothe our own ache. It never does. It only feeds the poison. Mrs. Weller's story is a brutal reminder that we have a sacred duty to face our own ghosts before they turn us into monsters. But the heart of this story, the part that makes us stand up and cheer, is Gideon Marsh. Because Gideon is the choice we all hope we would make. He didn't ride into town to be a hero. He rode in because he was a man haunted by his past, a man who had made a mistake 19 years ago and had been living with the consequences ever since. His grief wasn't just a wound, it had become his eyes. It allowed him to see what no one else could. The injustice, the echo of his lost wife in a poor girl's face. We all have a choice, every single day, to be a bystander or to be a Gideon. Most of the time, the injustice we see isn't a girl being boiled alive. It's a coworker being spoken over in a meeting. It's a friend being gossiped about. It's seeing someone struggling and looking the other way because we're too busy. To be a Gideon is to be the one who says, "Hold on, this isn't right." It's to be the one who uses their strength, whether it's their voice, their influence, or just their presence, to stand in the gap for someone who has no strength left. And look at where Gideon's strength came from. It came from his deepest pain. His loss became his power. His regret became his redemption. It's a powerful lesson for all of us. The hardest things we have been through, the struggles that have carved lines on our own faces, are not just scars. They are our training. They are the source of our empathy. They are what allow us to see the pain in others and say, "I understand," and mean it. You don't have to be the richest or the strongest person in the room to be a Gideon. You just have to be the one who is willing to stand up. In the end, this story is about the 3 forces that exist inside every single one of us, in every town, in every workplace, in every family. There is the mercy within us, the part that knows our own truth and must find the courage to hold on to it, even when we are alone. There is the Mrs. Weller within us, the bitter, wounded part that, if left unchecked, can turn our pain into poison and make us the villain of our own story. And there is the Gideon within us, the part that sees an injustice and, drawing strength from our own life's battles, finds the courage to say, "Not on my watch." The world we live in is its own kind of Wild West. It's full of dusty squares and hungry crowds. Every day, we are faced with a choice. We get to decide who we are. We get to decide which part of us we will feed. This story, the story of Mercy Whitmore, is now over. But yours is still being written, and every single day presents you with a new page. So let me ask you one final question as the sun sets on this tale. Who will you be? Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, help us keep these tales alive. Tell us your biggest lesson from Mercy's story in the comments below. What part resonated with you the most? There's so much power in sharing our perspective, and if you believe that stories like this matter, that they can teach us, inspire us, and remind us of who we want to be, then subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because every story has a lesson, and your story is still waiting to be told. We'll see you on the next ride.